Good evening, everybody. Tonight, we are going to be examining what the imperialist media has celebrated as a return to democracy. And that is, of course, the outcome of the most recent parliamentary elections in Hungary. And this saw the defeat of Victor Orban and the Fidesz party and the ascent of the man of no thoughts, of no ideas of his own, a certain Peter Magyar of the TISA party. But as always on the Liberation News Network, we look beneath the surface narrative, beneath the shallow interpretations of the bourgeois press. And so what we will be bringing to you tonight is a comprehensive analysis of why this is not some kind of triumph of the popular masses over an authoritarian dictator figure. It is something far more complex. There is an intersection of genuine mass discontent with the most sophisticated case of institutional election engineering in modern European history, carried out, of course, by our old friends in the European Union. It is also the activation of economic dependency as a political weapon. It is the culmination of a failed national bourgeois project that was structurally impossible from its inception. And it is also the continuation of Hungary's subordinated position within imperialist hierarchies, albeit now under new management. Tonight's analysis draws on the full theoretical arsenal of historical materialism, Gramsci's concept of the passive revolution, Wallerstein's world systems analysis, the dependency theory developed by Samir Amin, Arrighi's long cycles of accumulation, and David Harvey's work on accumulation by dispossession. We'll be tracing how Orbanomics, the attempts to construct capitalism with Hungarian characteristics, confronted structural constraints that rendered it ultimately impossible to achieve, namely German imperialist dominance, the structural bureaucratic power of the European Union, the trap for semi-peripheral capitalist nations, and the crisis of reproduction in Hungary itself, the crisis of human reproduction, which is leading to a demographic collapse that is common across most of the former socialist countries. We will move through the theoretical foundations, the destruction of socialist property relations in the 1980s, the rise of Orban's new attempt to manage the dependency of the Hungarian economy. There will be a detailed architecture drawn of the Orban economic policies. We will look at the death spiral of Hungarian demographics and the accumulation of contradictions that made the falling apart of the Orban system inevitable in the 2026 election, and how EU institutional intervention transformed what was a crisis in the system into a full-blown regime change operation. This is not merely a study of Hungarian politics. It is a case study in the impossibility of national bourgeois development within a tightly controlled imperialist world system for any semi-peripheral state that imagines it can achieve sovereignty through national capitalism. Now, as always, we're first going to look at the theoretical framework we're going to be using to analyze the recent events in Hungary and their history. So there are a series of, by now, I hope, familiar interconnected Marxist traditions that help us illuminate the different aspects of the Hungarian crisis. First of all, the work done by the late great Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci on the passive revolution. Antonio Gramsci's concept of the passive revolution is very useful to us here. In Gramsci's formulation, a passive revolution describes situations where dominant social groups undertake reforms from above to preempt revolutionary transformations from below. You'll recall this was much discussed in our program on Putin's Russia. Please be sure to go back into the archive and watch the various episodes of that, or the epic 4-hour-long live-streamed version that is on the live section of the YouTube page. So the revolutionary transformations from below, of course, are something that the ruling class hates and fears. So a revolution from above aims to preserve the fundamental structures of the existing social and economic order while introducing sufficient modifications to absorb discontent and maintain hegemonic control. The Orban system's economic policies exemplify this dynamic with remarkable precision. Following the 2008 global financial crisis and the collapse of the Hungarian neoliberal consensus, Fidesz mobilized nationalist and populist discourse to channel mass discontent away from any kind of systemic critique toward a system based on, or at least its public relations based on, identitarian grievances against foreign capital, Brussels bureaucrats, and international financial institutions, all of which are, of course, are very worthy of being hated, which is why, of course, it was very useful for Orban to hold them out as bogeymen. The reality, of course, of his policies was somewhat different. Now, this revolution from above represents what Gramsci termed a war of position, the gradual construction of a new hegemonic bloc through institutional capture, ideological transformation, and the creation of material bases of consent among strategic social sectors. However, Gramsci also warned of the limits of passive revolution when structural contradictions become insurmountable. The organic crisis of the Hungarian social formation, manifested in persistent fiscal deficits, external dependency, demographic collapse, and the erosion of productive capacity, cannot be resolved through hegemonic maneuvering alone. The Orban government's inability to transcend the structural constraints imposed by Hungary's position within the EU semi-periphery reveals the fundamental impossibility of national capitalism, of the kind that Orban was pursuing. Now, next in our theoretical framework, we use Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems analysis. The world systems analysis pioneered by Wallerstein would locate Hungary within what is known as the hierarchical structure of the capitalist world economy as a semi-peripheral state. This structural position, which is intermediate between the core of the EU, which is Germany, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, and the periphery of much of the global south. This is characterized by specific conditions that shape the possibilities and limits of national development strategies. The semi-periphery performs dual functions within the world system. It serves as a zone of exploitation for core capital, while simultaneously functioning as an intermediary exploiter of peripheral regions. This contradictory position generates specific political dynamics, including the possibility of a developmentalist state project aimed at upward mobility within the world system hierarchy. However, as Wallerstein demonstrated through historical analysis, such projects face systematic obstacles. Core states actively resist the emergence of new competitors, while the structural dependency of semi-peripheral economies on core markets, capital, and technology constrains autonomous development. Hungary's post-2010 trajectory illustrates these dynamics with painful clarity. The government's rhetorical commitment to economic sovereignty and to national capitalism confronts the material reality of German imperialist dominance over EU economic structures. German manufacturing capital, particularly in the automotive sector, maintains decisive control over Hungarian industrial production, while German financial capital, mediated through the ECB, that's the European Central Bank, and the EU institutional frameworks, constrains Hungarian fiscal and monetary policy. Next, we'll view things through the lens of Samir Amin's dependency theory. Now, dependency theory provides crucial insights into the structural mechanisms through which core periphery relations reproduce under development. Amin identified unequal exchange as the fundamental mechanism of imperialist exploitation, the systematic transfer of surplus value from peripheral to core economies through terms of trade that systematically undervalue labor in the peripheral nations and overvalue core technological and financial inputs. Amin advocated for delinking, a strategic disconnection from the imperialist world economy to enable autonomous national development. However, he also recognized that genuine delinking requires not merely political will, but the construction of alternative economic structures capable of sustaining development outside core periphery dependency relations. For small, open economies like Hungary, deeply integrated into EU production networks and markets, such delinking is structurally impossible without catastrophic economic disruption. The Orban government's Eastern opening strategy, announced in 2010 as a diversification away from EU dependency towards China, Russia, and other non-Western markets, represents a partial and ultimately failed attempt at selective delinking. While Chinese investments in battery manufacturing and electronic vehicle supply chains have increased significantly, EU markets remain dominant for Hungarian exports, and German industrial capital maintains decisive control over the commanding height of the Hungarian economy. The Eastern opening has thus functioned primarily as a political symbolism rather than structural transformation. Fourthly, we have Giovanni Arrighi's theory of the long cycles of accumulation. Now, according to Arrighi's analysis, the long cycles of accumulation illuminate the historical moments in which Orbanomics arrived. Arrighi identified recurring patterns in the history of capitalism. Periods of material expansion based on productive investment eventually exhaust their profitable possibilities, leading to phases of economic financial expansion, what he termed autumn, characterized by accumulation of capital through financial rather than productive channels. These financial phases inevitably culminate in systemic crisis and hegemonic transition. The contemporary world system is experiencing precisely such a hegemonic transition. The post-1945 Pax Americana is in terminal decline, while the rise of China and the fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs signal the emergence of a new systemic configuration. Within this context, the EU itself is experiencing profound contradictions. German industrial hegemony confronts challenges from both external and internal fragmentation, while the Eurozone's structural imbalances generate persistent crisis tendencies. Hungary's position within this crisis-ridden structure is particularly precarious. The government's attempt to construct capitalism with Hungarian characteristics coincides with the terminal phase of American hegemonic capital and the deepening crisis of European integration. The freezing of EU funds, the deterioration of relations with Brussels, and the turn towards Chinese financing all reflect attempts to navigate this systemic turbulence. However, as Arrighi's analysis suggests, periods of hegemonic transition are characterized by heightened uncertainty, increasing competition, and the narrowing of development possibilities for semi-peripheral nations. Finally, we have David Harvey's concept of accumulation by dispossession, which provides an essential framework for understanding the distributive dynamics of Orbanomics. Harvey identified this process as a necessary counterpart to expanded reproduction under capitalism. When the profit rate in productive sectors declines, capital seeks alternative revenues and alternative means of accumulation through the privatization of public assets, financialization, crisis manipulation, and state-led redistribution efforts. The Orban government's policies exemplified accumulation by dispossession in multiple ways. The 2010 to 2011 pension fund nationalization, the compulsory transfer of approximately 3,000 billion Hungarian florins, roughly 10 billion euros or 10% of GDP, from private to state control, represents a massive exercise in primitive accumulation, converting accumulated worker savings into state-controlled capital available for government deployment. The systematic reallocation of public procurement contracts to government-connected magnates, with approximately 60% of EU-funded tenders directed to Orban-linked entities, constitutes a form of accumulation through state-mediated redistribution amongst elite networks. Harvey's concept of spatial fixes, capital's attempt to resolve over-accumulation crises through geographical expansion and restructuring, also illuminates Hungarian dynamics. The government's infrastructure investments, EU fund absorption, and Chinese-financed development projects all represent attempts to create spatial fixes for the contradictions of Hungarian capitalism. However, as Harvey emphasizes, spatial fixes are temporary and contradictory. They differ but do not resolve underlying crises, while creating new contradictions and dependencies. Synthesizing these various frameworks, we advance the central thesis of tonight's analysis, that Orbanomics represented a failed attempt at constructing a national bourgeois development project within the structural constraints of the European Union, dominated as it is by German imperialism, and on the semi-periphery of the world system. The government's policies while achieving certain short-term political and distributive objectives, cannot overcome the fundamental contradictions of Hungary's dependent position within the German-dominated European economy. This impossibility manifests in multiple dimensions: structural dependency on German-led EU production networks, financial subordination to Eurozone monetary architecture, technological dependence as an assembly platform rather than an innovation center, the weakness of the Hungarian national bourgeoisie relative to foreign capital, and the geopolitical constraints imposed by EU rule of law conditionality and fund freezing mechanisms. Now, before we go any further, to understand the Orban period, we have to understand where Hungary came out of in terms of the counter-revolution that took place between 1989 and 1991, which saw the overthrow of Hungarian socialism, a counter-revolution which began the process of destruction of the Hungarian economic base, and the reduction of Hungary to being a peripheral nation within the EU system. Now, as I've stated elsewhere, Orban was one of the central figures in the counter-revolution of 1890-91. So it's ironic that he would be the one who actually tried, in a very imperfect way, to undo some of the damage of that counter-revolution. So the foundation of Hungary's contemporary political economy was not laid in 2010 with the return of Orban and Fidesz to power, but in the decade that followed 1989. Between 1989 and 1999, Hungary experienced not an organic structural transformation, but a destructive deindustrialization that created a dependent market economy that Orban would later manage but not actually transcend. The sectoral transformation was dramatic. In 1989, agriculture comprised 15.6% of the economy, industry 35.5%, and services 48.9%. A decade later, in 1999, Hungarian agriculture had collapsed in terms of its share of GDP to 5.4%. Industry fell to 27.5%, shedding 8 percentage points. The service sector grew to 52.9%. This quantitative convergence masked qualitative divergence. The government of Antal from 1991 to 1992 introduced bankruptcy legislation that liquidated hundreds of state enterprises that had been viable under the old Comecon market conditions. The collapse of the Comecon markets, which had absorbed 70% of Hungarian exports, was not compensated for by demand for Hungarian exports in the West. The result was destruction and asset stripping, not restructuring. 1.2 million economically active persons disappeared from the labor market between 1989 and 1998. Unemployment in Hungary surged from 1.7% in 1989 to 12% in 1999. Real wages declined by 25% between 1990 and 1995. The poverty rate hit 35% in 1996. GDP contracted cumulatively by 18% between 1990 and 1993. This was class war waged through government policy. The hardening of the budget constraint, to use the technocratic terms of the Hungarian economist János Kornai, was not a technical adjustment. It was a mechanism for dismantling the power of the industrial working class. Capacity, in terms of industry, was not upgraded but shuttered. The workforce was not retrained but discarded. The primary beneficiaries of this mass deindustrialization were foreign corporations. Hungary's privatization strategy deliberately rejected any voucher models in favor of cash sales to strategic investors, ensuring that national assets would be captured by capital from the imperial core nations. Between 1990 and 1999, total privatization receipts reached 1,601.3 billion florins. Of this, 59.7%, 955.4 billion florins, was received in foreign exchange. Approximately two-thirds of privatized wealth accrued to foreign buyers. By the late 1990s, foreign domination of the Hungarian economy was comprehensive. Foreign firms controlled 89% of industrial exports, 82% of industrial investment, 73% of industrial sales, 70% of banking capital, and 67% of the equity in telecoms companies. Germany alone captured 25.5% of foreign exchange receipts, exceeding all non-German European investors combined. Strategic sectors were parceled out amongst imperialist champion companies, Matav to Deutsche Telekom and Ameritech for $875 million, gas and electricity among GDF of France, Bayernwerk and RWE of Germany, EDF of France, and Italgas SNAM of Italy. The banking sector was privatized, in the words of one observer, without any publicity or debate. The 1995 so-called Dream Team acceleration under Finance Minister Leos Bokros and Central Bank President Georgi Soranyi, who were Western-trained technocrats implementing IMF-dictated programs, formally abandoned any preferential strategies for Hungarian citizens. The State Property Agency sold 42 companies in 4 months, raising $620 million. By 1937, government ownership in industry had fallen below 20%. Workers were systematically excluded from this process. Employee share ownership programs existed in law but were marginalized in practice. Trade unions were, in the documented words of the period, not involved either in the preparation or in the execution of this economic transformation. Privatization contracts were classified as being secret. This was the forcible integration of Hungary into the capitalist world economy as a dependent, deindustrialized, semi-peripheral zone. The industrial working class that had constituted the base of Hungarian socialism was dispersed, pauperized, and rendered politically impotent. By 2024, the service sector had come to account for 59.5% of Hungarian GDP, apparently converging with Western patterns. But unlike Western financialization, Hungarian services expansion was driven by low productivity, domestic services, non-tradable sectors, and dependent on EU subsidy circulation and labor-intensive activities rather than what is known in the West as the knowledge economy. The result was that economists call this a middle-income trap. Despite EU subsidies, private investments and productivity stayed low in Hungary in the non-tradable sector. The real convergence to Western efficiency and living standards remained elusive. The social costs were borne by the Hungarian working class. The privatization bonanza transferred national assets to core capital. The services expansion created a mirage of development, and the stage was set for what would come next. Not the resolution of these contradictions, but their management through increasingly Bonapartist methods. So by the time we get to the 2008 economic crisis that afflicted all of the imperial nations and their peripheral states, we have a situation where Hungary had gone from being an industrialized economy in the socialist period with a still strong agricultural sector to being one where it had been essentially turned into a neo-colony of principally German imperialism, where German imperialism dominated what industry was left. Hungary was used as a site of production by German imperialism in order to take advantage of the lower wages there. 76% of GDP in Hungary in 2010 was controlled by foreign entities via foreign direct investment, the highest in the Eastern European region, while domestic capital remained subordinated and fragmented. So the 2008 financial crisis exposed the vulnerabilities of this system and created the conditions for a political rupture. Now, this is what happened with Orban when he returned to power in 2010. So we will be covering that in the next episode, which will be out tomorrow. So this is the end of part 1, which gives us the necessary background of why Victor Orban became the Orban that was reviled by the EU. He was involved intimately in the counter-revolution of 1989. He was then prime minister in the 1990s when Hungary was being asset stripped and deindustrialized. And the consequences of that, the devastating consequences of that, confronted Orban when he returned to power in 2010. And the next period we'll be covering in part 2 will be that long period in office that Fidesz enjoyed. So please join us again tomorrow for that second part of this investigation into the Fidesz period, into the Orban period and Orbanomics. And bear in mind this, that everything we're talking about here is the direct result of the counter-revolutions of 1989. These are utter disasters for the Hungarian working class. And as we'll go on to see in the second episode, it is quite literally killing the Hungarian nation. So please join us again tomorrow for part 2. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube, Substack, Rumble, and all other platforms. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. And I'll be back with part 2 for you tomorrow.